Are all Africans genetically North African? This is an article by Stroh from the site Revoyi, linking genetics with reality, shorthand analysis of African DNA under archaeological context. So what's going on? Since as far as I can remember, there has been an obsession with a particular set of people across the many layers of the bioanthropology community. Researchers and enthusiasts alike sought the means to properly identify and label this mysterious group, as they hadn't really been known by anyone prior. It's been quite difficult, as these people lived and died but hadn't left behind any bones, culture, or industry. They merely contributed to the gene pool of those who go on to invent farming in the Middle East. I'm referring to the Baso-Eurasian population, a population who weren't African, aka Sub-Saharan African, but not quite Eurasian either. So who were they? Long story short, I don't know and will continue to not know until something else can substantiate their existence, like say, an industry, burials, or even a culture. However, I mentioned them to segue into a subjectively more interesting title of people whose existence has labeled by the same set of individuals who titled Baso-Eurasian. I'm speaking about Ancestral North Africans, or ANA. Considering the fact that an argued point was that the previously mentioned Baso-Eurasians were resident North Africans, it felt appropriate to draw comparisons between the two hypothetical groups. Although the differences are more compelling as the later group, Ancestral North Africans might actually have bones, industry, and a culture to tie them to, some of which will be touched upon later. And like how Baso-Eurasian is said to be the ancestor shared by all modern-day West Eurasians, ancient North African ancestry might be a component in virtually all Africans today. So what is ANA? Ancestral North African is supposedly a population which has diverged from an early East African population similar to the pure ancestors of Moda. They would hypothetically be the pre-Baso-Eurasians, or more descriptively, the African Baso-Eurasians. However, if this population existed, they would have contributed admixture to the ancestors of not only present-day North Africans, but also the West and East Africans and historical South Africans by extension. To put this into perspective, if the description holds true for this ghost African population, then the common genetic profile for so-called Bantu speakers would accompany this ghost admixture. The so-called Bantu expansion was said to be the largest migratory event in Africa. Their genetic influence also supersedes their cultural influence and language, having contributed to the populations such as all African rainforest hunter-gatherers. Most South African hunter-gatherer groups and some African so-called Nilo-Saharan and so-called Afro-Asiatic groups like the Maasai and the Iroquois, respectively. North Africans, by way of populations who prehistorically lived in North Africa, obviously harbors of ancient North African ancestry. And most East African populations, who by way of Northeast African diffusion, should also have shared this ancestry. As opposed to going down the copious list of populations in Africa who have ancient North African ancestry, we should instead focus on who doesn't. A few groups of people come to mind when making such inquiries, all of whom primarily resides in East Africa. To summarize down to two, the Southern Sudanese Nilotic people and the historic hunter-gatherer groups of the Great Lakes and above like the Hadza. We can effectively dismiss the latter, as while they haven't necessarily been linked to receiving ancestry from ancestral North Africans, they're effectively assigned to be related to the progenitors of ancestral North Africans. This is why Moda, a 4,500-year-old hunter-gatherer from Ethiopia, has and currently is been used to identify and serve as a proxy for Baso-Eurasian and North African ancestry. The Southern Sudanese groups, however, are a more interesting case. To date, there hasn't been a comprehensive look into if Southern Sudanese Nilotic people have any ancient North African ancestry, and anecdotally, it's been hard for even me to come across an admixture graph which included certain ancient African samples into the aforementioned Nilotic groups. So for a more in-depth look at Africa's genetic landscape, I went ahead and graphed an admixture chart. ADNA is a recent advent, however, current acceptance of human population history haven't changed much since it was first conceived with only extant DNA. For reference, most studies reiterated the same narratives with the branching off of Africans based on the quadrant of the continent that they currently reside. First, after reaching the stage of anatomically modern humans, or AMH, the South African hunter-gatherers branched off, then the West Africans, then the East Africans, and then after that, the Eurasians diversified. North Africans were said to merely be a set of Eurasians that made it back to Africa and stayed near the coast or trickled down the Nile corridor. If that model was our most accepted view of African biological history, then it would only be natural that future models would adhere closely to the concepts it suggested. So instead of a finding like that of Bolito Bay's ancient hunter-gatherers urging researchers to rebuild the human phyla from the ground up, we've never tried to figure out where they should fit on our current phyla admixture graphs and PCAs, or ignored them altogether in some subsequent genomic studies. It's quite disappointing that that's the workflow when it's been shown how different our understanding of old movements within and out of Africa could be when considering these individuals. Furthermore, we've seen how a different narrative can be crafted when reassessing what we know to better reconcile with newfound ADNA from Africa. For example, autosomal signals of southwestern Europe getting African admixture long before the Islamic slave trade. And in that case, the aforementioned Bolito Bay samples were used in praising illicit non-North African ancestry in ancient Iberians. The Bolito Bay South African hunter-gatherers were two individuals excavated from a shell midden near Bolito Bay shores. They lived about 2,000 years ago and were biologically most similar to modern so-called Khoisan-related groups of southern Africa. Their autosomal makeup was key to reassessing the age of anatomically modern humans due to their early divergence. The modern human age told by DNA had now been pushed from around 250,000 to 350,000 years ago. With that being said, I was careful in trying to model relationships between ancient individuals. For example, the following chart was primarily composed of ancient individuals for the purpose of avoiding much bias by modern interpretation when reconstructing the ancient human phylogeny. The goal was to build from the base up. Three populations I considered initially was an individual from Faroe rock shelter in South Africa, Moda, and a group of individuals excavated from the Shumlaka site. They each would be representative of the geographical quadrants of Africa mentioned prior, ancient South Africa, East Africa, and West Africa respectively. And not to my surprise, after counting for archaic hominids, all three of the quadrants seem to show evidence of them splitting around the same time. You can tell by the zero-length drift from anatomically modern humans to the fork that separates the ancient South African and Moda. This wouldn't be the first publication showing such nuance through these means. Lipson in 2020 showed the same relationship among Africans in the study that premiered the genomes of Shumlaka's individual. Down the line, I included Eurasians represented by an early Eurasian set to reflect the model crown Eurasian genome, an ancient East Asian dubbed Tianyuan man, and an ancient Russian from Sungir site representing Old West Eurasian diversity. The goal was to try to capture as much Eurasian diversity with as little samples as possible. Nonetheless, who was missing were North Africans and Eurasians, said to harbor deep ancestry, often regarded as basal Eurasian. I used individuals excavated from Tafarat and Rakafet Natufians to compensate for this respectively. As previously reported, both individuals required ancestry from a West Eurasian source and an East or Northeast African one. Considering the fact that the initial goal for computing the graph would be to examine if the South Sudanese Nilotic groups harbor any Ancestral North African related ancestry, I added the Dinka as the sole modern-day population. Along the way, while following the paths with the best fits guided by the permutations, I printed a graph that was markedly different from any published previously, which had required two separate out-of-Africa groups for the non-Africans, including Crown Eurasian. Such a scenario won't go ignored, as there had been evidence of sweeping selection across the board in favor of deep ancestry in Eurasia. However, this model will not be explored here. The focus remained the substructure which could be found among Africans, to which a simplification of Eurasian quadrant was imminent. However, to avoid oversimplification, I added an ancient sample of the Hobinian excavated from Bolikamse in northern Laos. This sample, based on runs of same method, seemed to have retained deep ancestry also in line with his mitochondrial haplogroup. From there I chose the simplest phylogeny to work with. As is, the samples allow for a three-way dispersal from a common anatomically modern human. For now, let's refer to them as Ancient West Sudanic or AWS, Ancient South African or ASA, and Ancient East African or AEA. A few things drew my attention. A potential East and West variant of Ancient West Sudanic. Geographically, East and West Africans drawing ancestry descending from Ancient West Sudanic and Ancient East Africans. Tafarat, which previously showed affinity towards West Africans, requiring no ancestral West Sudanic ancestry. And what seemed to be an ancestral North African is a paragroup to Eurasians without Neanderthal admixture and less drift. So basically what this is showing is that both East and West Africans have an autosomal commonality in the ancient West Sudanic branch of this genome, as well as the ancient East African branch of this genome, which again, this is validating the orature of West Africans coming from the East in a local branch of Ancestral North Africans. And Ancestral North Africans really, because of the evidence that we have to support their existence, what they would represent is the so-called basal Eurasian without any Neanderthal admixture and less migration. They would have already been in the African continent. So as far as some predictions, everything about the African substructure going back to ancient times can't be resolved. But it called my interest into who or what was ancient West Sudanic and an ancient North African. For ancient West Sudanic, my initial thoughts were the ghost human labeled by Lipson et al. This line of ancestry was heavily represented by modern-day West Africans in their schema. Furthermore, the requirement of its ancestry by Moda in 29% was also implied by their estimations when fitting Tafarat with West Africans in the Shumlaka samples. ANA, however, is a bit more grounded due to its strong presence in the region of Africa, which had garnered the most archaeological attention, the East. And as shown previously, West Africans, for example, most likely require a source of admixture, which had descended from the core ancestry of Moda. This model alone single-handedly makes this East African-related group, or Ancestral North Africans, the leading single distributor of ancestry on the continent. Again, these Ancestral North Africans that were localized in Northeast Africa are the leading single distributor of ancestry on the African continent. So for all of those who say it's impossible to connect contemporary West and Central Africans to the classical civilizations on the Happy River Valley in Kimi and Kush, the genetic and the archaeological evidence completely disputes that notion. To further explore the impact of this group, I sought to calculate the amount of potential Ancestral North African related ancestry in a select few populations. The process involved a not so complicated use of F-stats to prune ancestry that's both basal to Moda and shared drift with Eurasians. Essentially, what that'll be is a shared drift with a group that diverged between Moda's putative East African and Tafarat's non-Eurasian. And as you can see here, this is a chart of the Ancestral North African estimates. On the high end is Kenya Kakapel, 900 years before present, and on the very, very low end, you have the Congo Matangai population, 750 years ago. That high end it varies from 87% with Moda at 22% South African hunter-gatherer related, and then 86% with Moda at 42% South African hunter-gatherer related, and again, that's on the high end with the Kenya Kakapo population. And on the low end, those numbers were 7.19% and 5.84%, respectively. So these estimates, more so than the QP graph, were forthcoming on a few things. Reliably, the portion of this component follows a pattern to which Nilotic groups, followed by pastoral Neolithic and Horn Africans, then North Africans, before the onset of Neolithic European admixture, retain the highest signals. West Africans and admixed Southern Africans are then followed by more contemporary North Africans and neighboring Eurasians. For non-Africans, there seemed to have been a spike in Ancestral North African related ancestry in Israel before 8.6 thousand years ago. Somehow a bit further away, samples associated with the same material culture in Jordan was not as exposed to said admixture. They on the other hand retained similar percentages to the Rakafet Natufians. The Yoruba scores highest among those considered genetically West African. Among South Africans, a few samples found in Botswana scored the highest. The individual from Karo was considered to be a unique mixture of so-called Bantu Africans and ancient South Africans. However, they then would be replaced by later incoming so-called Bantu populations to the regions. Further northeast and back in time towards the Holocene lie another exception to the clan described above. The Malawi Hora individual, best described as an East African, admixed South African, also scored surprisingly high, despite their lack of so-called Bantu ancestry. Among the samples with a single asterisk, the Oromo outputted much more Ancestral North African-related ancestry than the next Cushitic group, which could possibly speak to nuanced substructure within the language family. However, due to their low S&P counts in relationship to other populations, when calculating some of their deep ancestry, comparisons to group without an asterisk is not significant. Could the findings of Ancestral North African be a statistical anomaly? Perhaps, but such a conclusion is undermined by potential archaeological correspondences. Unlike Basal Eurasian per se, Ancestral North African seems to have some cultural support based on its pattern of distribution. Be aware that their cultural identity, as well as the genetic identity of cultures, is still theoretical. Further, evidence is required to firmly place these people in their rightful context. First and foremost, if this population were to exist based upon what we've theorized prior, they'd probably have had a long standing in East Africa. This population must have expanded into North Africa sometime during or prior to the Late Stone Age, in which they diverged and later mixed with West Eurasian hunter-gatherers there and in the Near East. Some others could have likely remained in Eastern Africa, but expanded further during the last subpluvial. Some would have traveled west into the Sahara to form complex mixture with the descendants of ancient West Sudanic people and maybe some of the earlier West Eurasian admixed populations of North Africa who had expanded south. Ideally, there is a cultural phenomena that loosely corresponds with this trend. This would be the Aquilithic culture, characterized by African barb bone points and dotted wavy line pottery. It had been suggested that this tradition followed the distribution of so-called Nilo-Saharan languages. That assertion was also backed up when overlaying the sites when the bone points were discovered in Nilo-Saharan languages. This could speak to the association with the ancestral North African component calculated above and so-called Nilotic populations such as the Dinka. However, Yellen, who proposed that most barred bone points in Africa bore enough similarity to be defined as derived from a common tradition, concluded that there was a lack of correlation between the usage of said tradition and any ethno-linguistic affiliation. He noted, examination of barred bone points in the broadest perspective permits several conclusions and speculations. First, the data clearly show that this tradition does not map up to any tightly defined linguistic or biological group and does not serve as a marker for any cultural entity as defined by common anthropological usage of the term. The northern Kalahari points are definitely associated with the so-called Khoisan peoples, the Inshangan with the so-called Nilotes or Nilote predecessors, and it is difficult to imagine a culture which extends from the Central Sahara through the East African lakes. And that's John Yellen, Barb Bone Points, Tradition and Continuity in Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa. Yellen's assessment is still fair when looking at Figure 3, from Drake. Barb bone point stretches as far north as Morocco and as far south as Botswana. This pattern might indeed outrange so-called Nilo-Saharan distribution. This gives more credence to the pattern we see when parsing ancestral North African related ancestry, as in this case there is a strong biological affinity as opposed to a linguistic one to cover its distribution. Wavy line and dotted wavy line pottery follows a similar narrative, however more so to the exclusion of the north and the more southern regions of Africa. Interestingly, wavy line pottery, though linked to the same early Holocene expansions, might have its origins in Western Africa, unlike the observed barb bone points which probably coalesced in East Africa before 20,000 years ago. As it appears, sites in Niger, for example, uphold the oldest dates and nearby regions show non-derivative diversity and style, not seen in Khartoum, for example. However, the true chronology of this culture's diffusion hasn't been established yet, as discoveries within the Sahara and the Sahel remain fragmented. More evidence and discussion regarding dotted wavy line pottery and their potential genetic affiliates should be explored in detail in a later publication. Considering the fact that most of these events are dated towards the Holocene associated with North Africans, it needs further investigation. For one, barb bone points in North Africa were associated with the Ibero-Mauritian, an industry which includes taffy-rod individuals. They are at most contemporaries with the Khartoum Neolithic and would have predated Holocene expansions. These groups would have had to migrate northwest sometime between 30,000 and 14,000 years ago, prior to the interactions within the Green Sahara. Also, the biological affinity measured by morphology or morphometrics disrupts patterns of continuity even among Africans who were found within or south of the Sahara. For instance, Ibero-Maurusians were given morphological classification which separated them from most other Africans. To further complicate matters, certain groups within the context of Eastern Africa were given biological association with North African groups that included Ibero-Maurusians. Some examples would be the Nubian group, the Kuru or Iberian culture, and the Holocene Hora. These North African biological affiliations would be to the exclusions of most Africans associated with the Aquilithic traditions or Becker's Saharo-Nilotic complex. Just like the prehistoric inhabitants of the Wadi Hawar, the early and middle Holocene population of the Malian Sahara and the late Pleistocene Jebel Sahaba Tushka population belong to the Saharo-Nilotic population complex. None of these biologically sub-Saharan groups shared any direct ancestors with prehistoric North Africans. The A group, on the other hand, was not part of the Saharo-Nilotic population complex. And that is according to Becker, the prehistoric inhabitants of Wadi Hawar. So here you kind of see a suggestion by Becker that though these populations were involved within the same cultural complex, they weren't necessarily related genetically, and that kind of contradicts some of the genetic evidence that we have displayed here. So it can be proposed that among ancestral North Africans, there was a substructure most likely molded by temporal distribution and interaction with other Africans, and maybe West Eurasians. Pure ANA ancestry would probably have been long gone before even the Ibero-Mauritian in North Africa. In any case, the most pristine ANA population could have been populations of the Nile, not exposed to West Eurasian admixture. These would have been the Mesolithic Nubians mentioned earlier, such as the Tushka or the Jebel Sahaba population. Regardless, if the previous statement is true or not, it remains that the aforementioned groups were not the progenitors of late Stone Age North Africans, but probably adjacent descendants of a common East African ancestor, in which an assertion like the one made in Pendergast in 2019, where Northeast African ancestry is on the climb from being South Sudanese related by the way of Mesolithic Nubians to Near East related by the way of biological North Africans, and it is probably close to reality. Populations like the Dinka could have been a combination of the mysterious West Sudanic group and an ancient North African population who formed a complex culture in the Sahara. Then, as described in Becker, had recombined with the people who showed continuity from the Mesolithic Nubian in the Nile. Biological similarities with North Africans in East Africa, and to a lesser extent West Africa, could have been the result of North Africans who had penetrated the Sahara or traveled up the Nile deep into more southern regions. To contextualize the material cultures mentioned above, I propose the idea that African barb bone points had been attached to the early ancestral North African, as seen in the figure above. It was derivative of ancient East African barbed bone point, which had shown up to 90,000 years of continuity there. Waveland and Dada Waveland pottery is attached to Saharan Africans, who had formed a complex as a mixture of ancient West Sudanic Africans who permeated further north into the Sahara, and early Saharans who were a derivative of ancestral North Africans. The tradition could have been passed to the people of the Upper Nile, such as the late Mesolithic Nubians, in which the technique diversified. Subsequent Nilo-Saharan populations, such as the Dinka, would be the descendants of the early Nilatic pastoralists. West Africans is represented by the populations in Gambia and Nigeria, as well as the putative Bantu autosome would be of Atlantic West African descent. And contemporary North Africans would be a mixture of various West Eurasian and North African hunter-gatherers, such as the Ibero-Mauritian. It remains to be seen if the bulk of ancestral North African ancestry had resided in geographical Northeast Africa in its entirety, and what it'll mean for the concepts such as Basal Eurasian. Pagani in 2019 reviewed the landscape and written on the possibility of a bottleneck group of Africans who had remained in North Africa after around 60,000 years ago. He explained the necessity of such ancestry being widespread in every African in order for North Africans to be uniquely North African. But the context weren't in lieu of African ancestry and diversity, but instead Eurasian. When speaking on regions of deep ancestry shared between North Africans and West Eurasians who harbor said ancestry, he said, "If these regions are simply reflecting shared ancestry between any African and any Eurasian population, rather than the presence of a Natufian-like genetic leaking across the Green Sahara, then they should be equally present in all African populations, and the resulting population split estimates should not be affected by the masking procedure." And that's Luca Pagani in What is Africa? A Human Perspective. He went on to even state that North Africans who would have needed to be biologically Eurasian at the time in order to explain continuity. Such extreme scenarios are not necessary to explain the relationship between the ancient individuals in question. We don't yet know to which extent North Africans have been bottlenecked or contributed to receiving contributions from neighboring Eurasian populations in order to make such assertions on the requirement of their genetic history. However put, there is a case to be made that regardless of the importance of actual Eurasian admixture in North Africa, there was an indigenous presence outside of the diversity that categorizes North African populations. Nonetheless, it is ironic that the question as to who is responsible for the bulk of so-called sub-Saharan African ancestry is reliant on Saharan and North African population history. On top of the evidence mentioned, there are quite a few industries and genetic factors that contribute to the departmentalization of Northern and Southern Africa. What was mentioned so far was only the beginning of what's to be unveiled. This is a call to action for people who share an interest in human population history to take a deeper and more comprehensive look into African archaeology and bioanthropology. If admissible, such a finding like this shared ANA component would have been buried under preconceived notions and socio-political views on the history of Africans and what makes them Africans.